Imagine being pulled over for no reason, feeling the weight of judgment before a single word is spoken. A quiet suburban street becomes the stage for a tense encounter when a black driver, minding his own business, is stopped by a police officer whose intentions seem anything but professional. The officer, with an air of authority, begins questioning him, but his tone carries something deeper and unsettling bias that's hard to ignore. As the exchange unfolds, the driver remains calm, trying to diffuse the tension while the officer seems to escalate it. Unbeknownst to both of them, someone else is watching closely, a superior who knows all too well the officer's history and has been waiting for the right moment to step in. What happens next could change everything for both men, but for now, the air is thick with suspense, and the outcome is far from clear. This is a story about power, prejudice, and accountability, a reminder that sometimes, justice has eyes in unexpected places. Stick around to see what unfolds, because this confrontation is about to take an unexpected turn. The officer, standing tall and rigid by his squad car, peers through the driver's window. The faint hum of the engine is the only sound between them, but it feels deafening. His eyes scan the driver, sizing him up as though there's something inherently wrong with him just for being there, just for existing. His hand rests near his holster, not drawing a weapon, but the subtle movement of his fingers is enough to signal power, a power he feels he can wield in that moment. The driver, hands visibly placed on the steering wheel, keeps his calm. He doesn't react to the officer's intense scrutiny. His mind races, not in panic, but in awareness. He's been here before too many times, in fact. The subtle racial profiling that seems to play out every time he enters certain neighborhoods. The uncomfortable feeling of being watched, judged, and categorized before a single word is even spoken. It's the kind of thing that gnaws at you, but over time, it becomes something you learn to manage, even if you don't get used to it. License and registration, the officer demands, his voice sharp, with a hint of condescension. His eyes don't leave the driver's face. It's almost as if he's daring him to make a wrong move. Of course, the driver replies, his voice even but steady, showing no signs of the tension building in his chest. He reaches into his glove compartment, his movements slow and deliberate, trying to keep everything in sight. He knows the routine. His fingers brush against the paperwork, feeling the cool edge of his license before pulling it out. The car is old, but everything inside it is legal, clean, well maintained, with no history of anything remotely suspicious. Yet here he is, again, facing a situation that feels all too familiar. As he hands over the documents, his mind briefly flashes to the stories he's heard, stories about people like him who found themselves in far worse situations. He's seen the news, read the headlines, and scrolled through the accounts of others who weren't as lucky as he's been in the past. What if today isn't the same? What if the officer decides today is the day he crosses a line that can't be uncrossed? The officer takes the documents but doesn't immediately glance at them. Instead, he eyes the driver, the scrutiny in his gaze intensifying. He starts pacing back and forth beside the vehicle, his boots hitting the pavement with purpose. Every step feels like a drumbeat, a rhythm building toward something uncertain. The driver's grip tightens on the wheel, but he forces himself to breathe. Meanwhile, a few streets over, a black SUV pulls into a quiet parking lot. Inside, a supervisor watches the scene unfold through a live video feed, his eyes narrowed in concentration. He's been monitoring this officer for weeks, noticing patterns, behaviors, things that go beyond simple policing. The officer in question has a history. It's been documented, the complaints piling up over the years. Complaints of unnecessary force, complaints of racial profiling, complaints that were too often dismissed or buried under layers of bureaucracy. But today is different. Today, he's not just watching from a distance, he's waiting for the officer to cross that line, waiting for the moment when something has to change. Inside the SUV, the supervisor shifts in his seat, watching the officer's every move. He's been in law enforcement for over 2 decades, but even he can't deny the sense of unease that fills him as he watches the interaction unfold. He knows how these situations can go. He's seen it happen too many times. He's seen how a simple traffic stop can escalate, how a single word can spark violence, how a situation meant to be routine can end in tragedy. And he's worried that today, he might be watching just such a moment. Back at the traffic stop, the officer finally glances at the driver's documents. His eyes flick over the information, almost dismissive in his attitude, as if the contents don't even matter. The moment of tension stretches on, with nothing being said for several beats. Then, the officer looks back up at the driver, his lips curling into a faint, almost smug smile. "Everything checks out," the officer says, his tone still icy, almost as if he's been forced to concede a point he didn't want to make. But there's something else in his voice now, an air of challenge. "But that doesn't mean I trust you." The driver's heart skips a beat. He's been in enough of these situations to know that this isn't just about the traffic stop anymore. The officer has already decided what he believes, what he wants to believe. The color of his skin is enough to draw suspicion, enough to make him a target. For a moment, the driver wonders if this is where it all goes wrong. What if the officer decides to dig deeper, to search the car, to escalate things further? He knows how quickly these moments can spiral out of control. One wrong move, one word taken the wrong way, and the officer could make this a far bigger issue than it needs to be. He's seen it happen before, people who end up detained, arrested, or worse, simply because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. The officer steps closer to the window, leaning down just enough to peer inside. His face is inches away from the driver now, and the driver can feel the officer's breath as he speaks. "Got anything to hide?" The officer sneers. "Any weapons? Drugs?" The driver fights the urge to flinch. He knows the answer is no. He knows he has nothing to hide, nothing to fear, except for the prejudice the officer might hold in his heart. But there's a flicker of doubt in his mind. What if the officer decides otherwise? What if the officer decides that his calmness is just an act, a cover for something he's not seeing? Just as the driver opens his mouth to respond, a voice crackles over the officer's radio. The officer freezes, a momentary distraction breaking the tension. The supervisor, in the black SUV, presses a button on his dashboard, sending the signal to intervene. He's been listening to the exchange on a secure channel, and the time has come. "Cut it, now," the supervisor's voice comes through the radio, crisp and commanding. The officer stands up straight, visibly startled by the interruption. He glances down at his radio, momentarily disoriented. For a second, he looks almost vulnerable, unsure of what just happened. Then, his gaze shifts back to the driver, the smirk disappearing from his face. "Hold tight," the officer mutters, barely audible, before he turns and walks back to his squad car. The driver watches in confusion, trying to make sense of the sudden shift in the officer's demeanor. The tension in the air doesn't dissipate, it lingers, unresolved. The officer sits in his car, talking quietly into the radio, his voice now low and strained. The supervisor's voice is barely audible but firm, urging the officer to back off. The driver wonders what's happening. Is this a power struggle? Is there something he doesn't know? Is the supervisor on his side? The uncertainty gnaws at him, and the moment stretches on, thick with unanswered questions. What will happen next? Will the officer be held accountable, or is this just another moment where the system lets things slide? And what about the supervisor? What role will he play in this story? The driver's hands clench around the wheel as he waits. The stakes feel higher than ever, and the silence is deafening. The officer sits in his squad car, fingers hovering over the radio, the static buzzing in his ears as he listens to the supervisor's calm but stern instructions. His hands tighten around the wheel as if the pressure of the moment is too much to bear. He looks at the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of the black driver still sitting in the car, eyes locked on him with an air of disbelief. The officer's jaw clenches, but his mind races, unsure whether he should proceed or back off. The supervisor's voice cuts through the uncertainty again. "Just let him go. Now." It's like a switch flips inside the officer. The stern commands from his superior are clear and final, and for a moment, he's not sure what to feel. There's a part of him that resents the intervention, that wants to exert control over the situation, to follow through with the questioning. But there's also a part of him that understands the risk of pushing things further. He knows that pushing too hard might mean consequences that are bigger than just him, bigger than this traffic stop. The officer takes a long, deep breath, looking out at the driver who hasn't moved a muscle. His pulse quickens. He knows he could make this harder. He could find a reason, any reason, to escalate things. But the looming presence of his supervisor in the background holds him back. He's been trained for moments like this, trained to know when to pull back and when to push forward. He knows when it's better to walk away, even if it stings his pride. With a grunt, the officer steps out of the car and walks back to the driver's window. The air between them crackles with lingering tension, but there's a subtle shift. He can't quite bring himself to meet the driver's eyes. He looks down at the documents in his hands instead. "I'm letting you go," the officer mutters, almost as if the words are forced out. No ticket, no further questioning. Just go. The driver, still in a state of cautious disbelief, glances at the officer for a long moment, his mind racing. Was this for real? Was the officer really backing down? Was he being let go because the situation was defused, or because something else had happened behind the scenes? For a heartbeat, there's nothing but silence. Then, slowly, the driver nods, his voice steady but laced with the quiet dignity that's become a shield against moments like this. "Thank you," he says, the words simple, but they carry weight. And with that, he drives off. But the officer stands still for a moment, watching the taillights fade into the distance, his heart still pounding in his chest. He's not sure what to make of it, whether this was the right choice or whether he had been coerced. He knows the supervisor is watching him, waiting for a report, waiting for an explanation. But the officer doesn't feel relief. There's something else gnawing at him, a sense of unease that lingers like a shadow. Inside the black SUV, the supervisor watches the driver pull away, a slight sigh escaping his lips. He's seen it all play out in real time, a calm intervention that, in this case, prevented things from spiraling out of control. But even as he watches the officer through the cameras, his mind is already racing through what could have happened if things had gone differently. He leans back in his seat, letting the moment settle. It's not a perfect resolution. Nothing about this situation feels entirely resolved. The officer still doesn't know why he was told to stop the confrontation, and the driver still doesn't know why he was allowed to leave without incident. There's a story in that. The supervisor knows that he's been in law enforcement long enough to see the cracks in the system, the places where things are left unsaid and undone. The supervisor picks up his phone and dials. The call rings once, then twice, before a voice answers. Everything went according to plan, the supervisor says, his voice even, but there's an edge there, a hint of exhaustion. The officer backed off. The driver's on his way. No incident. The voice on the other end pauses for a moment, then responds, "Good. But we need to keep an eye on this. This can't be a one-off. There's more to address here." The supervisor exhales slowly. "I know. But at least today, we stopped something from going too far." As the call ends, the supervisor stares out the windshield, his thoughts drifting. He thinks of the officer, the young man who had been walking a fine line for years, too blinded by his own biases to see the bigger picture. Today, the intervention may have been just enough to prevent disaster, but tomorrow, what will happen? Will the officer learn from this? Or will the system fail again, as it often does? The supervisor knows that this isn't a story with a clear, happy ending. It's one step in a much longer journey. Meanwhile, the driver, now several miles down the road, can't shake the feeling that he's been part of something bigger than just a traffic stop. His heart is still racing, the adrenaline from the encounter beginning to fade, but the weight of it lingers. He glances in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the flashing lights again, but the road behind him is clear. He lets out a slow breath, unsure of how to process everything. He knows he's lucky this time. He knows he made it out without incident. But what about next time? What about the next stop, the next officer, the next assumption made because of the color of his skin? There's a part of him that wonders if this is just another blip in the ongoing struggle, a moment where the system worked for a brief second, but ultimately, the root of the problem remains. But there's another part of him that knows it's not all for nothing. Every small victory, every time he walks away from a situation like this, is a reminder. It's a reminder that not everything is as it seems, that even in a system riddled with flaws, there are moments where accountability can shine through. Even if the results are imperfect, the actions taken can still make a difference. Back at the precinct, the officer sits in his squad car, the report from the stop in front of him. He stares at the paper for a long time, his mind still reeling from the strange turn of events. He wasn't expecting this outcome. He wasn't expecting to back down. But something about it gnaws at him. Something about that intervention, it didn't sit right. It was almost as if someone had been watching, waiting to step in at the perfect moment. He thinks of the supervisor, his voice stern, but with a subtle hint of concern. He's seen the look in the supervisor's eyes before, heard it in his voice. Maybe it wasn't just the driver that was being watched. Maybe it was him, too. As the officer starts typing up his report, he reflects on what just happened. It's more than a routine stop. It's a reminder that the line between right and wrong is not always as clear as it seems, and sometimes, the best thing you can do is listen to the people around you, to the ones who hold the power, but also listen to your own conscience. Because sometimes, justice is not just about following the rules, it's about knowing when to stop, when to let go, and when to do better. And as the officer submits the report, he knows one thing for certain: this won't be the last time he questions what it means to serve and protect. The story doesn't end here. It's just one chapter in an ongoing struggle for fairness, for accountability, and for the recognition of every person's right to dignity.